The year was 1878, and the Dakota Territory was a land of harsh beauty and even harsher realities. In a time when the fate of a woman could be decided by men with money and power, one rancher's desperate gamble would lead to an unexpected collision of worlds. As Elizabeth Hayes stood trembling on the auction block, her father's debts weighing heavier than the chains of propriety that bound her, no one expected the silent figure watching from the shadows. No one anticipated how the arrival of a Lakota warrior named Swift River would forever alter the course of their lives amidst the sprawling plains where two cultures fought for survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above the Hayes Ranch, a vast canvas of blue that seemed to mock Thomas Hayes as he studied the foreclosure notice in his weathered hands. 6 years of drought had reduced his once prosperous cattle ranch to a shadow of its former glory. The bank had finally called in its loans, leaving Thomas with 30 days to produce the sum of $5,000 or forfeit everything his family had built over 3 generations. Inside the modest ranch house, Elizabeth Hayes stood at the kitchen window, watching her father's shoulders slump under the weight of their circumstances. At 22, she had grown into a woman of quiet strength, with chestnut hair that framed a face marked by both gentleness and determination. She had been managing the household since her mother's passing 5 years prior, holding together what remained of their family with steady hands and unwavering resolve. "Pa," she called softly, stepping onto the porch. "Supper's ready." Thomas turned, hastily folding the notice and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Be right there, Lizzie." Elizabeth wasn't fooled. She'd seen the men from the bank riding away earlier. That day, their tailored suits and polished boots stark against the dusty landscape of their struggling ranch. "How bad is it this time?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. For a moment, Thomas considered another lie, another reassurance that things would improve with the next season. But the weight of years spent holding back the truth had worn him down. "We've got 30 days, he admitted, his voice rough with defeat. $5,000 or we lose everything. Elizabeth absorbed the news in silence, calculating in her head the value of their remaining livestock, the few pieces of her mother's jewelry they'd held onto through the lean years. Even if they sold everything, they wouldn't come close to the sum needed. "We'll find a way," she said finally, more to comfort her father than from any real belief. Thomas didn't respond, and that silence frightened Elizabeth more than any words could have. 20 miles away, in the town of Clearwater, Marshal Wilson Crawford sat in his opulent office above the bank he owned, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. At 45, Crawford had built an empire in this territory, acquiring properties and businesses through means that often skirted the boundaries of the law. His narrow face, framed by meticulously trimmed silver-streaked hair, bore the cold calculation of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Hayes got the notice?" he asked the man standing before his desk. Samuel Blackwood, Crawford's right-hand man and the bank's loan officer, nodded. "Delivered it personally this morning. He doesn't have a prayer of raising that kind of money." Crawford's thin lips curved into something approximating a smile. "Good. I've had my eye on that land for years. The creek running through Hayes's property is the only reliable water source for miles. Once I add it to my holdings, I'll control every drop of water in the county." "And the daughter?" Blackwood asked, his tone carefully neutral. Crawford's eyes glinted. "Elizabeth Hayes has grown into quite the beauty, hasn't she? Perhaps I'll offer Hayes an alternative arrangement. Miles away from Clearwater, beyond the boundaries of settler territory, a different kind of council was taking place. In a secluded valley sheltered by towering cottonwoods, the remaining free band of Lakota had established a temporary camp. Their numbers had dwindled over years of conflict and forced relocations, but they maintained their ways, moving like shadows through lands that had once been theirs alone. Among them was Swift River, known by the white settlers as James Blackhawk, when necessity forced him to interact with their world. At 30, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man straddling two realms. Born to a Lakota mother and a white father who had respected and eventually joined his mother's people. His father, a former army scout who had chosen love over loyalty to the military, had ensured his son could navigate both worlds, though Swift River had chosen to remain primarily with his mother's people after his parents' deaths. The council. Fire burned low as Swift River listened to the tribal elders discuss their increasingly precarious position. The treaties made and broken, the encroachment on their hunting grounds, the sickness that had claimed so many of their children the previous winter. "The soldiers search for us," said Grey Wolf, the eldest of their band. "They say we must go to the reservation at Pine Ridge. To die slowly instead of quickly," another elder muttered. Swift River remained silent, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He had seen the reservations, had witnessed proud people withering under the weight of confinement and dependency. But he had also seen enough of the white man's world to know that resistance meant eventual annihilation. "I will go to Clearwater," he said finally. "We need medicines, and I can trade the furs we've collected. Perhaps I can learn more about the soldiers' plans." Grey Wolf studied him with eyes dimmed by cataracts, but sharp with wisdom. "Be careful, Swift River. Your father's blood may allow you to walk among them, but never forget that they see only your mother's people when they look upon you." Swift River nodded, knowing the truth of these words in the scars he carried from past encounters with those who hated what he represented. The merging of worlds they wished to keep forever separated. The following morning, Thomas Hayes rode into Clearwater with a desperate plan forming in his mind. He had one asset that might interest a wealthy man like Crawford, a parcel of land separate from the ranch, a small holding left to him by a distant uncle. It wasn't much, but it contained a natural spring that Crawford might value. The bank's imposing facade loomed over the dusty main street, a declaration of wealth and power in a town where most struggled to keep food on their tables. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post, straightened his worn hat, and steeled himself for the humiliation that awaited. Samuel Blackwood intercepted him in the bank's marble-floored lobby. "Mr. Hayes, I assume you've come about with your loan. I'd like to speak with Mr. Crawford directly," Thomas replied, his pride still intact despite his circumstances. Blackwood's smirk suggested he found the request amusing, but nodded toward the staircase. "He's expecting you." Crawford didn't rise when Thomas entered his office, merely gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Thomas, please, sit. Whiskey?" He held up a decanter of amber liquid. Thomas shook his head. "I've come to discuss an alternative. Arrangement for my debt. Have you now?" Crawford leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I'm listening. I have a parcel of land about 5 miles east of my ranch. There's a natural spring on the property." Crawford waved a dismissive hand. "I'm aware of it. That pittance of land isn't worth half what you owe." Thomas felt the floor shifting beneath him. He had expected negotiations, not outright dismissal. "Then what do you suggest? My family has worked that ranch for 3 generations. Surely there must be some accommodation." "Actually," Crawford interrupted, rising to pour himself another drink, "I've been thinking about a different kind of arrangement." He paused, studying Thomas over the rim of his glass. "Your daughter, Elizabeth, she's unmarried, isn't she?" Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "My daughter is not part of this discussion. But she could be the solution to your problems," Crawford continued as if Thomas hadn't spoken. "I'm a widower, as you know. I find myself in need of a wife. and your daughter is widely regarded as one of the most beautiful young women in the territory." Thomas stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "You're suggesting I sell my daughter to you?" Crawford's expression hardened. "I'm suggesting a marriage that would benefit all parties. Elizabeth would want for nothing as my wife. Your debts would be forgiven, and you could continue working your ranch without interference. And if I refuse, then you have 30 days to produce $5,000 or your family legacy ends." Crawford's voice was devoid of emotion. "Consider it carefully, Thomas. I'm offering your daughter a life of comfort and security. What can you offer her except poverty and hardship?" Thomas left the bank with Crawford's proposal burning a hole in his conscience. He knew what his answer should be, a resounding rejection of the very idea that Elizabeth could be bartered away. Like cattle, yet the spectre of losing everything, of seeing his daughter reduced to destitution, forced him to consider the unthinkable. Elizabeth knew something was wrong the moment her father returned. His face had always been an open book to her, and now it was written with conflict and shame. "What happened in town?" she asked that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. Crawford made an offer. Hope flared briefly in Elizabeth's chest. "For the ranch? Did he give us an extension?" "Not exactly." Thomas took a deep breath. "He offered to forgive the debt entirely if you would agree to marry him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Elizabeth felt as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her, sending everything she knew and understood sliding into an abyss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Crawford is almost 50, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And his first wife, I know." Thomas cut her off, unable to hear the rumors they both knew, that Crawford's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances after less than a year of marriage. "I told him no, of course. We'll find another way. But as days passed, that other way remained elusive." Thomas rode to neighboring ranches seeking loans or work, only to find others struggling under the same drought conditions. He tried to sell what livestock remained at a decent price, but buyers sensed his desperation and offered pittances. Elizabeth watched her father aging before her eyes, the burden of imminent failure etching deeper lines into his face with each passing day. She thought of her mother, of the promises she'd made at her deathbed to care for her father, to keep their family whole. On the 15th day after the bank's notice, Elizabeth made her decision. "I'll do it," she told her father over breakfast. "I'll marry Crawford." Thomas looked up sharply. "Absolutely not. I would rather lose everything than sell my daughter to that snake." "It's my choice," Elizabeth insisted, her voice stronger than she felt. "This ranch is our home. It's all we have left of Mother. I won't stand by and watch it taken from us. If there's something I can do." "Lizzie, you don't understand what kind of man Crawford is." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, "but I also understand that without this ranch, we have nothing. At least as Crawford's wife, I might be able to help you, to make sure you're taken care of." Thomas saw the determination in his daughter's eyes, the same stubborn resolve her mother had shown in times of hardship, and knew that arguing was futile. "Let me at least try to negotiate better terms." In Clearwater that same day, Swift River moved cautiously through the town, his presence drawing suspicious glances despite the civilized clothing he wore when among the settlers. He had completed his trading, exchanging furs for medicines and ammunition, and was preparing to leave when he overheard a conversation outside the saloon. "Crawford's finally getting his hands on the Hayes place," a man was saying to his companion. Word is he's taking the daughter as payment for the old man's debts. Elizabeth Hayes, the second man, whistled low. Crawford's a lucky bastard, though I heard he's not giving her much choice in the matter. Since when do women have choices? Out here, the first man laughed. Crawford's arranged some kind of auction tomorrow night, invitation only, supposedly to formalize the arrangement, but everyone knows it's just Crawford showing off his new prize. Swift River moved away, processing what he'd heard. He had encountered Thomas Hayes several times over the years, a fair man who had once allowed the Lakota to hunt on the far reaches of his property when game was scarce elsewhere. Unlike many settlers, Hayes had shown respect rather than fear or hatred. The concept of trading a woman to settle a debt struck a deep chord of wrongness in Swift River. Among his people, women were valued members of the community, not property, to be bartered. He had seen too many Lakota women taken by force or coercion by white settlers, their spirits broken along with their bodies. As he mounted his horse at the edge of town, Swift River made a decision that would alter the course of many lives, including his own. Instead of returning directly to his people, he would observe this auction and see if there was some way to intervene without bringing danger to his band. The following evening, Elizabeth sat numb as Mrs. Peterson, the town seamstress, made final adjustments to the dress Crawford had sent over, a creation of emerald silk that cost more than everything Elizabeth owned combined. "You're a fortunate girl," Mrs. Peterson said, pins clenched between her teeth. "Many would give their eye teeth to marry a man of Mr. Crawford's standing." Elizabeth said nothing, her thoughts elsewhere. She had spent the night alternating between resignation and desperate plans for escape, only to circle back to the reality that running would solve nothing. Her father would still lose everything, and where could she go that Crawford wouldn't find her? Thomas watched the preparations with growing despair. Crawford had agreed to his counter-proposal, a formal engagement announcement at a gathering of the town's prominent citizens, rather than an immediate wedding. But Thomas recognized it for the empty victory it was. Once the engagement was announced, Elizabeth's fate would be sealed in the eyes of society. "It's not too late," he told Elizabeth as they rode toward town in their best clothes. "We can turn around right now, head north, maybe to Canada, start over." Elizabeth reached across the wagon seat to squeeze her father's hand. "And live as fugitives, always looking over our shoulders? No, Pa. We face this with our heads high, like Mother would have wanted." Crawford had arranged for the engagement announcement to take place at Clearwater's grandest venue, the newly built town hall with its gleaming windows and polished floors. As Thomas helped Elizabeth down from the wagon, he noticed how every eye turned to watch his daughter's entrance, her beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the solemnity of her expression. Inside, the hall had been transformed into a showcase of Crawford's wealth. Crystal chandeliers imported from the back east cast rainbow prisms across white-clothed tables laden with delicacies. A string quartet played in one corner, their refined melodies incongruous in a frontier town. Crawford himself approached immediately, resplendent in a tailored suit that emphasized his tall, lean frame. "Elizabeth," he greeted, taking her gloved hand and bringing it to his lips. "You look exquisite." Elizabeth forced herself to meet his eyes, searching for some glimmer of warmth or humanity that might make her future bearable. She found nothing but cold calculation and something darker, more possessive, that made her skin crawl beneath the fine silk of her gown. "Mr. Crawford," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Marshall, please," he corrected, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. "After all, we're to be family now." As Crawford led Elizabeth through the crowd, introducing her to business associates and their wives, she became aware of something unsettling about the gathering. The looks directed her way weren't merely curious or admiring, they contained assessment, as if she were livestock being evaluated before purchase. When Crawford guided her to a small raised platform at the front of the hall, Elizabeth's confusion crystallized into horrified understanding. This was no simple engagement announcement. The platform, the evaluating gazes, Crawford's proprietary hand at her waist, this was exactly what the gossips had whispered. An auction in all but name. "Gentlemen," Crawford addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly hushed room, "I've invited you here tonight to witness a most advantageous arrangement. As you know, our territory is built on fair exchange and mutual benefit." Thomas stepped forward, alarm evident on his face, but was blocked by Samuel Blackwood and another of Crawford's men. "The Hayes family has fallen on difficult times," Crawford continued, "and in the spirit of community assistance, I've offered to assume their considerable debts in exchange for this lovely young woman's hand in marriage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth stood frozen, humiliation burning through her as Crawford continued his speech, detailing her virtues as if she were a prized mare, her youth, her beauty, her skill at household management. "However," Crawford added, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous generosity, "in fairness to Miss Hayes, I've decided to entertain competing offers. After all, she deserves the very best match possible." A shocked silence fell before the room erupted in confused conversation. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the full extent of Crawford's scheme. He was not only acquiring her as property, but doing so in a manner designed to elevate his status further by demonstrating that he could outbid any other man present. "The starting bid," Crawford announced over the commotion, "is $5,000. The exact amount of Hayes' debt to my bank. Do I hear a higher offer for this exceptional young woman?" Outside the town hall, Swift River observed the proceedings through a window, his jaw tight with controlled anger. He had expected some form of coercion, but the blatant dehumanization taking place inside struck at something fundamental in his warrior's code. The young woman on display, standing straight-backed despite her obvious distress, showed a courage that resonated with him. As he watched, a plan began to form, dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but driven by the conviction that what was happening within those walls was a perversion of both his people's values and the white man's own professed Christian principles. Swift River moved silently toward the back entrance of the hall. Decision made. Whatever happened next would change many lives, but he could not stand aside and watch another spirit broken on the altar of white man's greed. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere had transformed from a social gathering to something far more primitive. Several of Clearwater's wealthiest men had begun calling out bids, some genuinely interested in acquiring Elizabeth as a wife, others simply enjoying the spectacle of Crawford's power play. $5,500, called Walter Simmons, the aging owner of the territory's largest freight company. $6,000, countered Jeremiah Booth, a cattle baron from the eastern side of the county. Elizabeth stood motionless on the platform, her face a careful mask that concealed the storm of emotions beneath. She had agreed to marry Crawford to save her father's ranch, but this public humiliation, this reduction of her worth to monetary value, had never been part of her understanding. Thomas Hayes struggled against Blackwood's restraining grip. "This wasn't our agreement, Crawford," he shouted above the bidding. "You said an engagement announcement, not this travesty." Crawford barely spared him a glance. "The announcement is being made, Hayes. I'm simply ensuring your daughter gets the best possible arrangement." His thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "After all, isn't that what any father would want?" The bidding continued, climbing past $7,000. Elizabeth's hands, hidden in the folds of her emerald silk gown, had balled into tight fists, her nails cutting half-moons into her palms. The pain anchored her, kept her from screaming or fleeing in mindless panic. $8,000, outbid Crawford himself, effectively silencing most of the other participants. He turned to the assembly with a triumphant expression. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your interest, but I believe Miss Hayes will find no better offer than..." The rear doors of the hall burst open with a sound like a thunderclap. Every head turned as a figure strode purposefully down the center aisle. Swift River had abandoned his civilized attire, appearing instead in the traditional dress of a Lakota warrior, buckskin leggings, a bone breastplate over his bare chest, and a single eagle feather fastened in his long black hair. At his waist hung a sheathed knife and a revolver, a deliberate display of both worlds he inhabited. A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Women drew back instinctively, while several men reached for weapons hidden beneath suit jackets. Crawford's face darkened with fury at this interruption of his carefully orchestrated event. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, gesturing to his men. "Remove this savage immediately." Swift River ignored him completely, his dark eyes fixed on Elizabeth. When he spoke, his voice carried the natural authority of a man accustomed to being heard. $10,000. The crowd's stunned silence deepened. Elizabeth stared at the warrior, confusion warring with the first fragile tendrils of hope. Thomas Hayes ceased his struggling, equally bewildered by this unexpected development. Crawford recovered quickly, his voice laced with contempt. "This is a private gathering of respectable citizens. Your kind isn't welcome here, Black Hawk." Swift River finally turned his attention to Crawford. "I see nothing respectable about men who trade women like horses." He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small leather bag, tossing it onto the nearest table. The drawstring loosened on impact, spilling a cascade of gold nuggets across the white tablecloth. $10,000, he repeated, "in gold. Double your debt, Hayes." He addressed Thomas directly now. "Unless you prefer your daughter to go to a man who speaks of honor while behaving like a thief." Crawford's face flushed with rage. "This is absurd. No one would allow a white woman to be claimed by someone offering fair value," Swift River interrupted, his composure a stark contrast to Crawford's growing agitation. "I thought that was the purpose of this auction." The final word carried all his disgust for the proceeding. Elizabeth found her voice at last. "I have no intention of being claimed by anyone." Despite her trembling hands, her tone was steady. "This entire arrangement was to settle my father's debt, nothing more." Swift River inclined his head slightly, in acknowledgement of her spirit. "Then allow me to settle it, with no claim on you." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. Crawford signaled to Blackwood and his other men, who began moving towards Swift River. The Lakota warrior made no move toward his weapons, but his posture shifted subtly, a coiled readiness evident in every line of his body. "This is outrageous," Crawford sputtered. "Sheriff Miller, arrest this man for disrupting the peace." The town sheriff, who had been observing from near the refreshment table, stepped forward reluctantly. "On what charge exactly, Crawford? Offering money at your auction?" "He's carrying weapons in town limits," Crawford countered, "and that gold is undoubtedly stolen." Swift River's expression remained impassive. "The gold was traded fairly for furs with miners from the Black Hills. As for weapons, I count 17 armed men in this room, including yourself, Crawford. Will you arrest them all?" Elizabeth stepped down from the platform, moving with determined grace through the crowd, until she stood between Swift River and Crawford's advancing men. "Mr. Crawford, you arranged this gathering to settle my father's debt through my marriage. This man has offered more than enough to clear that debt. By your own terms, that concludes our arrangement." Crawford's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This isn't about money, Miss Hayes. This is about propriety, about the natural order of things. Surely you don't imagine you could possibly—" "What I imagine," Elizabeth interrupted with newfound boldness, "is no longer your concern. The debt will be paid. Our business is concluded. Thomas Hayes moved to stand beside his daughter, a quiet pride replacing his earlier desperation. "My daughter is right, Crawford. You've been outbid, fair and square. Take the gold and consider our account settled." For a tense moment it seemed Crawford might order his men to attack regardless of witnesses, but he was too shrewd for such an obvious misstep. Instead, he forced his features into a cold smile. "Very well. The deal is accepted. The Hayes debt is cleared." His gaze shifted to Swift River, naked malice replacing his mask of civility. "But remember, Black Hawk, this territory has laws against certain associations, laws that are strictly enforced." Swift River met his gaze without flinching. "I know your laws, Crawford, better than you know mine." He turned to Elizabeth and her father. "You should leave now. This place has grown hostile." Outside, in the cool evening air, Elizabeth felt as though she could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, the distant howl of a coyote, a song of unexpected freedom. "What just happened in there, Din?" Thomas asked, his voice oscillating between bewilderment and relief as Swift River joined them on the street. "Your daughter was being treated unjustly," Swift River replied simply. "My father taught me that injustice ignored becomes injustice accepted." Elizabeth studied him with new curiosity. The stories she'd heard about the half-breed Black Hawk had painted him as dangerous, unpredictable, a man caught between worlds and belonging to neither. Yet there was a clarity of purpose in his actions that spoke of someone who knew exactly where he stood. "That gold," Thomas began awkwardly. "I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Swift River cut him off. "Not for my sake, but for hers." He nodded toward Elizabeth. "Crawford is not a man who forgives being thwarted. He will look for other ways to claim what he believes should be his." Elizabeth shivered, knowing the truth of his words. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Swift River was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "6 winters ago, when sickness came to my people, and the government agent refused us medicine, a rancher allowed us to hunt on his land when game was scarce elsewhere. He brought blankets and herbs to our children when no one else would acknowledge our existence." He looked at Thomas. "You may not remember this kindness, Hayes, but my people do." Recognition dawned on Thomas's face. "The winter of 72. You were among that band." Swift River nodded. "My mother was one of those who survived because of your aid." A slight smile softened his stern features. "The Lakota do not forget debts of honor." The sound of the town hall doors opening interrupted their conversation. Crawford emerged, surrounded by his men, his expression thunderous as he scanned the street and spotted them. "We should go," Swift River said quietly. "Crawford has too many allies here." "Our wagon is this way." Thomas gestured down the street. "You'll come with us?" The question held an invitation that surprised even him. Swift River hesitated. "That would not be wise. Crawford's men will follow, and my presence would only endanger you further." "Then where will you go?" Elizabeth asked. "Crawford will surely have the sheriff searching for you, claiming that gold was stolen." "Do not concern yourself with my safety," Swift River assured her. "I know these lands better than any who would pursue me." As Crawford's group started in their direction, Swift River melted into the shadows between buildings. Elizabeth and her father hurried to their wagon, aware of eyes following their movements from windows and doorways along the main street. Thomas urged their horse to a brisk trot as they left town, both of them silent until Clearwater's lights had faded behind them. Only then did he exhale shakily. That was either providence or madness, perhaps both. Elizabeth stared at the road ahead, her mind still processing the evening's extraordinary events. "What happens now, Pa?" "We return to the ranch, pay off the debt properly with bank drafts rather than gold nuggets, and then—" He trailed off, realizing they had been so focused on avoiding disaster that they hadn't considered what would come after. And then we rebuild, Elizabeth finished for him, newfound determination coloring her voice. We still have the ranch, our livestock, our home. That's more than many have. Thomas reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand. You're so much like your mother. She'd be proud of how you handled yourself tonight. As they crested the hill, that would take them home. Neither noticed the three riders who emerged from the tree line behind them, following at a discreet distance. Dawn was breaking over the eastern plains when Elizabeth stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with the previous night's events. Crawford's cold eyes, the shocked faces of Clearwater's elite, and most persistently, the steady gaze of the Lakota warrior who had upended everything with a single bid. The sound of approaching riders drew her attention to the road. 3 men on horseback were approaching the ranch house at a steady pace. Elizabeth's hands tightened around her cup as she recognized Samuel Blackwood at the lead. "Pa!" she called over her shoulder, setting down her coffee and moving to the edge of the porch. Thomas emerged from the barn, sawed-off shotgun in hand. He positioned himself between the approaching riders and the house as Blackwood and his companions reined in their horses in the yard. "What business do you have here, Blackwood?" Thomas demanded, not raising the shotgun but keeping it visible. Blackwood's thin lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just delivering a message from Mr. Crawford. He wants you to know that while last night's transaction has been officially recorded with the bank, he remains concerned about your daughter's welfare." "My daughter's welfare is no longer any of Crawford's concern," Thomas replied evenly. Blackwood's smile widened. "Mr. Crawford disagrees. He believes Miss Hayes may have been unduly influenced by that savage Blackhawk. In fact, he's offered a reward for information regarding the Indians' whereabouts. Seems he's suspected of other crimes in the territory." Elizabeth stepped off the porch to stand beside her father. "Swift River committed no crime. He offered fair payment for our debt, which Crawford accepted publicly before witnesses." "Perhaps," Blackwood conceded with a shrug, "but harboring a wanted man would certainly constitute a crime. If he should turn up here, for instance." He let the implication hang in the air. "We have no idea where Blackhawk went after Clearwater," Thomas stated firmly. "Now, unless you have actual business here, I suggest you leave my property." Blackwood tipped his hat mockingly. "Just delivering a friendly warning, Hayes. Crawford doesn't take kindly to being humiliated. He'll be watching this place. If that Indian shows his face anywhere near here, there'll be consequences." He turned his horse, then paused. "Oh, and he also mentioned that the territorial tax assessor will be reviewing property values in this area soon. Seems some landowners might be significantly underpaying." With that parting threat, Blackwood and his companions rode away, leaving Thomas and Elizabeth staring after them in troubled silence. "Crawford won't let this go, will he?" Elizabeth said finally. Thomas shook his head grimly. "Men like Crawford don't lose gracefully. He'll look for other ways to get what he wants." They spent the day in a state of watchful tension, jumping at distant sounds and scanning the horizon for more unwelcome visitors. By evening, Elizabeth's nerves were stretched to breaking point. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, when movement at the edge of their property caught her eye. A lone figure on horseback was approaching from the west, not from the direction of Clearwater, but from the untamed wilderness. Beyond their ranch, the rider moved with a fluid grace that immediately identified him to Elizabeth, even before she could make out his features. "Pa," she called softly. "He's come back." Thomas joined her at the window, his expression conflicted. "That's either very brave or very foolish of him." "Or both," Elizabeth murmured, remembering Swift River's actions the previous night. They met him at the edge of the yard, well away from the house in case watching eyes were trained on their property. Swift River dismounted in one fluid motion. His appearance once again modified to draw less attention, gone were the traditional garments of a warrior, replaced by the practical attire of a frontiersman, though the eagle feather remained woven into his hair. "You shouldn't have come here," Thomas said without preamble. "Crawford's got men watching the ranch. There's a bounty on your head." Swift River nodded, unsurprised. "I expected as much. Crawford is not a man who forgets a slight to his pride." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded document. "That is why I bring you this." Thomas took the paper, unfolding it carefully. His eyes widened as he read. "This is a deed of sale for the eastern parcel, the one with the spring, made out to James Blackhawk." He looked up in confusion. "I don't understand." "Crawford wants your water rights," Swift River explained. "That's why he pursued your daughter so aggressively. With control of your ranch and the natural spring on your eastern parcel, he would dominate all water access in the region." Elizabeth stepped closer, studying Swift River with newfound understanding. "You knew this all along?" "I suspected," he corrected. "Crawford has been systematically acquiring water sources throughout the territory. Your ranch is one of the few remaining properties with independent water rights that he doesn't control." Thomas frowned at the document in his hands. "But why would you buy this land? And how, even with the gold you gave us?" "The eastern parcel is strategic," Swift River interrupted. "It connects your remaining ranch land to the territory still used by my people. If I own it legally by white man's law, Crawford has no legitimate way to prevent my people from accessing the water." The brilliance of the strategy wasn't lost on Thomas. "You're creating a buffer zone," Swift River inclined, his head in acknowledgement. "And an alliance, if you're willing. My people need safe passage and water access. You need protection from Crawford's predatory tactics." Elizabeth's mind raced ahead, seeing the possibilities. "With your legal ownership of the eastern parcel, Crawford can't cut off our water access either. He'd have to deal with both of us. And one legal landowner, who happens to be Lakota, is harder to eliminate than an entire band with no recognized rights," Thomas added, impressed despite his ingrained caution regarding alliances with native peoples. Swift River's expression remained grave. "Make no mistake, Crawford will not abandon his ambitions easily. By aligning yourselves with me, you invite his full wrath." "His full wrath was already coming our way," Elizabeth pointed out. "At least now we have a fighting chance." Thomas studied the deed again, then met Swift River's steady gaze. "This is more than repayment of a debt. Why risk yourself further for our sake?" For the first time, Swift River's composure faltered slightly as his eyes briefly shifted to Elizabeth before returning to Thomas. "My father chose to leave his world behind for the love of my mother and her people. He taught me that bridges between worlds are fragile things, easily burned by fear and hatred. Yet without such bridges, neither world can thrive." He gestured to the land around them. "This territory was once solely Lakota hunting grounds. Now it is claimed by your government. The future will belong to those who can walk in both worlds with honor." The distant sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Swift River tensed, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Crawford's men," Thomas said urgently. "They must have spotted you riding in." "You should go," Elizabeth told Swift River. "If they find you here," Swift River's expression hardened with resolve, "I will not run. Running only convinces men like Crawford that intimidation works." He turned to Thomas. "Do you have the gold I gave you yesterday?" Thomas nodded, hidden in the house. "Good. Tell them I forced you to accept it, that I threatened your daughter." His voice softened as he glanced at Elizabeth. "Your safety matters more than my reputation." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "I will not lie to protect myself at your Expense. That's exactly what Crawford expects, that we'll turn on each other out of fear. The approaching riders were visible now, at least 6 men, with Blackwood and Sheriff Miller among them. Thomas made a swift decision. "Get to the barn," he told Swift River. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor. Hide there until we know what they want." Swift River hesitated, clearly reluctant to hide rather than confront the approaching threat. "Directly, please," Elizabeth added quietly. "A confrontation now serves no one." Something in her voice reached him, and Swift River nodded once before leading his horse toward the barn, moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to danger. Blackwood's voice carried across the yard as the riders approached. "Hayes, we know Blackhawk is here. Surrender him now, and Crawford might be persuaded to show leniency." Thomas positioned himself in front of the house, shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. Elizabeth stood on the porch behind him, her heart pounding, but her expression carefully composed. "What's all this about, Sheriff?" Thomas called, addressing Miller rather than Blackwood. "Since when does the law ride onto private property making demands without cause?" Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable as he reined in his horse. Unlike Blackwood and the others, he wore his official badge, lending a veneer of legitimacy to what was clearly Crawford's private vendetta. "We have information that James Blackhawk was seen heading in this direction," Miller explained. "He's wanted for questioning regarding that gold he produced last night. Several miners have reported thefts from their claims recently." "That's a convenient accusation," Elizabeth remarked, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "especially since those miners haven't appeared publicly to make these claims." Blackwood's expression darkened. "What's your tone, Miss Hayes? Interfering with a lawful investigation is a serious matter." "Is this a lawful investigation, Sheriff?" Thomas challenged. "Or is it Crawford using your badge to pursue a personal grudge?" Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a decent man at heart, but his position depended on Crawford's goodwill, as did most official posts in Clearwater. "We need to search the property, Hayes," Miller said, avoiding the direct question. "If Blackhawk isn't here, you have nothing to worry about." Thomas stood his ground. "You have no warrant, Sheriff. No evidence of any crime. Just Crawford's spite, because a Lakota outbid him in his own rigged auction." The standoff might have escalated further, if not for the distant sound of multiple horses approaching at speed from the direction of Clearwater. All heads turned as a cloud of dust announced the arrival of new participants in the unfolding drama. "Now, what?" Thomas muttered, bracing himself for reinforcements to Crawford's posse. To everyone's surprise, the riders who emerged from the dust cloud were not Crawford's men. At their head rode Judge Nathaniel Chambers, the circuit court judge whose jurisdiction included Clearwater County. Behind him came 4 U.S. Marshals, their badges gleaming in the fading light. Sheriff Miller straightened in his saddle, suddenly looking far less certain of his position. Blackwood's face was drained of color. Judge Chambers, a stout man with iron-gray hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors despite his official position, surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes. "Sheriff Miller," he called in a voice accustomed to commanding courtrooms, "I'm surprised to find you engaged in what appears to be an unauthorized search of private property." Miller removed his hat, suddenly deferential. "Just following up on reports of a wanted man, Your Honor." "Wanted by whom, exactly?" the judge inquired, dismounting with the assistance of one of the marshals. "I don't recall signing any warrants for arrest in this county today." Blackwood intervened smoothly. "There have been reports of gold theft from several mining operations. Your Honor, we have reason to believe James Blackhawk, who was in Clearwater last night, may be involved." Judge Chambers fixed Blackwood with a penetrating stare. "Interesting, because I've spent the day reviewing certain banking records from Clearwater that suggest a different kind of theft might be taking place, one involving fraudulent foreclosures." and manipulation of property records. He turned to Thomas. "Mr. Hayes, I believe you recently received a foreclosure notice from Crawford's bank?" Thomas nodded, bewildered by this unexpected turn of events. "Yes, Your Honor, though the debt has since been settled." "So I've heard," the judge replied with a thin smile, "through a rather unorthodox auction from what my sources tell me." He glanced toward Elizabeth with a look of grandfatherly concern. "Miss Hayes, I hope you weren't too distressed by Mr. Crawford's theatrical approach to debt collection." Before Elizabeth could respond, one of the marshals called out, "Riders come in, Judge. Looks like Crawford himself this time." Indeed, another group was approaching rapidly from town, Crawford at the lead, his face visible even at a distance. As a mask of barely contained fury, Judge Chambers sighed heavily. "Right on cue. Marshal Jenkins, please ensure Mr. Crawford understands he is to remain civil when he arrives. I have no patience for theatrics tonight." As Crawford's party drew nearer, Elizabeth found herself wondering about Swift River, hidden in the root cellar beneath the barn. Whatever happened next would determine not just their immediate safety, but the future of everything they had fought to protect. The pieces on the board had shifted dramatically, but whether this unexpected arrival of judicial authority would prove their salvation or merely delay the inevitable confrontation remained to be seen. One thing was certain: nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. Marshal Crawford's horse kicked up dust as he brought it to an abrupt halt in the Hayes yard. His normally composed features were distorted with rage as he surveyed the unexpected gathering before him, particularly the presence of Judge Chambers and the U.S. Marshals. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Judge?" Crawford demanded, dismounting with less than his usual grace. "This is a local matter concerning stolen property and a dangerous fugitive." Judge Chambers regarded Crawford with the weary patience of a man who had seen too many like him in his years on the bench. "Interesting. Sheriff Miller described it as an investigation into gold theft. You call it a fugitive pursuit. Yet I see no warrants, no formal charges filed with my court." He removed a folded document from his coat pocket. "What I do have, however, is a sworn affidavit from 3 witnesses describing what can only be termed as human trafficking disguised as a debt settlement." The color drained from Crawford's face. "That's absurd. I merely offered a mutually beneficial arrangement to help the Hayes family." "By auctioning Miss Hayes to the highest bidder?" the judge interrupted sharply. "Perhaps you'd like to explain that interpretation of banking regulations to the federal authorities. I'm sure they'd be fascinated by your innovative approach to debt collection." Thomas and Elizabeth exchanged startled glances. Neither had expected outside intervention, let alone federal attention to their plight. Crawford's expression hardened as he regained his composure. "Judge Chambers, I've always respected your position, but you're overstepping your jurisdiction. The territorial governor has received several concerning reports about banking practices in this region," the judge finished for him. "Which is precisely why I was dispatched to investigate," he gestured to the marshals, "with appropriate federal authority." Sheriff Miller, sensing which way the wind was blowing, subtly distanced himself from Blackwood and Crawford's other men. "Your Honor, I was merely responding to concerns about—" "Save it, Miller," the judge cut him off. "We'll discuss your selective enforcement of the law later." He turned to Thomas. "Mr. Hayes, I understand there may be a connection between your recent difficulties and Mr. James Blackhawk, who I'm told offered payment for your debt at yesterday's event." Before Thomas could formulate a response that wouldn't endanger Swift River, the barn door opened. Swift River emerged, walking with deliberate confidence toward the assembled group. He had made his decision. Hiding would not resolve what must be confronted directly. "I am here," he announced simply, coming to stand near Elizabeth and her father. "There is no need to pressure the Hayes family on my account." One of Crawford's men reached for his weapon, but a sharp gesture from Marshal Jenkins stopped him. "The next man who draws without my order will be shot," the marshal stated flatly. Judge Chambers studied Swift River with interest rather than hostility. "Mr. Blackhawk, your intervention last night has caused quite a stir in Clearwater." Swift River inclined his head slightly. "Judge Chambers, we met 3 years ago at the treaty discussions with Walking Eagle's band." Recognition flickered across the judge's face. "Indeed we did. You served as translator." He turned to the others. "Mr. Blackhawk is known to the federal court as a man of integrity who has assisted in several delicate negotiations between territorial authorities and the Lakota Nation." Crawford's expression twisted with disbelief. "You can't possibly take the word of an Indian over a respected businessman. I take the word of honest men over dishonest ones, regardless of their heritage," the judge interrupted coldly. "And I have significant evidence suggesting your business practices warrant close examination, Mr. Crawford." He gestured to one of the marshals, who produced a leather portfolio, including documentation of systematic water rights manipulation across 3 counties. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she glanced at Swift River, whose expression remained impassive, though his eyes held a glint of vindication. He had been right about Crawford's true motives all along. Crawford's facade of righteous indignation crumbled, replaced by calculation. "Whatever complaints have been raised, I'm certain we can resolve them amicably. Perhaps in private, Judge?" His tone suggested he was accustomed to problems disappearing after appropriate conversations with officials. "Judge." Chambers smiled thinly. "Oh, we'll have plenty of time for discussions, Mr. Crawford, beginning with your immediate return to Clearwater, where you'll remain while we audit your banking records." He nodded to 2 of the marshals. "Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Crawford and Mr. Blackwood back to town. Ensure they understand the importance of cooperation." As the marshals moved to flank Crawford and his right-hand man, the banker made one last desperate play. "This is about water rights, isn't it? Hayes's eastern parcel. I'll double whatever Blackhawk paid for it." Swift River stepped forward. "The land is not for sale at any price. The deed is properly filed and witnessed." Crawford's eyes blazed with hatred. "Do you think this changes anything? Indians don't hold property for long in this territory, legally or otherwise." "There are ways." "That's quite enough, Mr. Crawford," Judge Chambers interrupted sharply. "Add threatening remarks to the growing list of concerns." He nodded to the marshals. "Remove him." As Crawford was led away, still hurling veiled threats, Sheriff Miller approached the judge awkwardly. "Your Honor, I want to clarify that I was merely following what I believed were legitimate concerns about—" "Save it for your deposition, Sheriff," the judge cut him off. "For now, I suggest you return to town and consider whether your badge serves the law or Marshal Crawford's interests." He glanced meaningfully at the remaining deputies. "That applies to all of you wearing stars." After the sheriff and his men departed, an odd silence fell over the Hayes yard. Elizabeth felt as if she had been holding her breath for days and could finally exhale. Thomas looked similarly stunned by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Judge Chambers turned to them with a more genuine smile. "My apologies for the dramatic entrance, but we've been building a case against Crawford for months. When reports of last night's auction reached us, it provided the perfect opportunity to confront him directly." "How did you know?" Elizabeth asked, finding her voice. "About the auction, I mean." The judge's eyes twinkled. "Not everyone in Clearwater benefits from Crawford's machinations. There are still good people willing to stand against corruption." He glanced at Swift River. "Though few with your particular flair for public confrontation, Mr. Blackhawk." Swift River's expression remained serious. "Crawford will not surrender his ambitions easily, even with legal challenges. His type rarely does." "True enough," the judge acknowledged, "which is why I'll be stationed in Clearwater for the foreseeable future, overseeing a complete investigation." He turned to Thomas. "Your debt has been properly recorded as paid in full, Mr. Hayes. The gold has been deposited with my court clerk for verification, but there appears to be no question about its legitimacy." Thomas extended his hand to the judge. "We are grateful for your intervention, Your Honor, though I admit I'm still confused about how our situation warranted federal attention." Judge Chambers clasped Thomas's hand firmly. "Water rights manipulation affects interstate commerce and territorial governance, both federal concerns. Crawford's schemes have disrupted several treaty arrangements with native bands as well." He glanced at Swift River. "Your instincts about his true motives were correct, Mr. Blackhawk." As the judge prepared to depart with his remaining marshals, he paused. "I should mention, this property will likely face continued scrutiny from Crawford's allies. Even with him under investigation, I suggest you both remain vigilant." His gaze shifted between Elizabeth, Thomas, and Swift River. "And perhaps maintain your unconventional alliance. It seems to have served you well thus far." After the judge and his men departed, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Swift River were left alone in the yard as twilight deepened around them. The sudden absence of immediate threat left an awkward uncertainty in its wake. "You didn't have to reveal yourself," Elizabeth said finally, turning to Swift River. "You put yourself at risk unnecessarily." Swift River's dark eyes met hers. "There is no honor in allowing others to face danger in my place." Thomas cleared his throat. "I suppose we should discuss this alliance the judge mentioned." He gestured toward the house. "Perhaps over supper? You must be hungry after hiding in that root cellar." A ghost of a smile crossed Swift River's face. "I would be honored to share your meal." As they walked toward the house, Elizabeth found herself studying Swift River with new curiosity. He had upended her world twice now. First, with his dramatic intervention at the auction, and then with his refusal to hide when danger threatened. Everything she had been taught about his kind seemed inadequate to explain the complexity of the man who walked beside her. "Crawford made one valid point," Swift River noted as they reached the porch. "The eastern parcel will remain contested territory, regardless of legal ownership. My people's safety depends on maintaining that buffer zone." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps we should formalize this alliance. Make it something more substantial than just neighboring landowners." Elizabeth glanced between her father and Swift River, sensing a shift in possibility that both thrilled and terrified her. The future stretching before them now was nothing like the one she had imagined even days ago. It was uncertain, dangerous, but somehow more vibrant with potential. As the three of them stepped into the warmth of the Hayes home, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside. The alliance forming under that humble roof would face countless challenges in the days ahead, but its foundation had been laid in the most unexpected of circumstances: an auction block where a woman's worth was measured in gold, and a warrior's intervention that valued something far more precious than money. In the distance, Crawford's men rode toward Clearwater, their employer seething with plans for revenge. Judge Chambers and his marshals followed, representatives of a law that had finally extended its protection to those who needed it most. And between these opposing forces stood the Hayes Ranch, transformed from a simple homestead into contested ground where the future of the territory might well be decided. Elizabeth lit the lamps as darkness fell completely, illuminating the faces of the two men with whom her destiny had become intertwined: her father, weathered but unbowed by hardship, and Swift River, whose courage had changed everything. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the crucible of Crawford's auction. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, it was one she chose freely. And that made all the difference. 2 weeks after Judge Chambers' dramatic intervention at the Hayes Ranch, Clearwater was transformed. The once imposing bank building stood oddly quiet, its doors open but its operations constrained under the watchful eyes of federal auditors. Marshal Crawford remained technically free but confined to town limits while the investigation proceeded, his movements monitored by U.S. Marshals who had established a temporary office in what had once been Crawford's private meeting room at the Hayes Ranch. A different kind of transformation was underway. The morning sun found Elizabeth atop the windmill platform, adjusting the mechanism that had fallen into disrepair during their financial troubles. Below, Thomas worked with 2 Lakota men to repair sections of fencing along their northern boundary. The alliance Swift River had proposed was taking tangible form as members of his band provided labor and expertise in exchange for secure access to water and hunting grounds. Elizabeth shaded her eyes against the sun, scanning the eastern horizon. Swift River had departed 3 days earlier to meet with other Lakota leaders about expanding their arrangement. His absence felt more significant than it should have after such a brief acquaintance. A hollow space in conversations, a missing presence at the supper table where he had begun joining them regularly. "He'll be back by sundown," came her father's voice from below. Thomas climbed the windmill ladder with surprising agility for a man his age, joining his daughter on the narrow platform. "You've checked that horizon a dozen times this morning." Elizabeth felt color rise in her cheeks. "I'm just concerned about the agreement. If the other Lakota bands reject his proposal—" "This isn't about the agreement," Thomas interrupted gently, "and we both know it." She turned back to the windmill gears, adjusting a bolt with unnecessary force. "I hardly know him, Pa. Your mother and I knew each other less than a month before we decided to marry," Thomas reminded her. "Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't caught up to yet." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the wrench. "It's not that simple. The world rarely accepts anything worth fighting for at first," Thomas said. He placed a weathered hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I've seen how you look at each other. Whatever's growing between you two, don't let fear of what others might think strangle it before it has a chance to bloom." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, a shout from below drew their attention. One of the Lakota men, a younger warrior named Running Fox, was pointing toward town. A cloud of dust indicated riders approaching, at least a dozen, moving at speed. "That's not Swift River's group," Thomas muttered, suddenly alert. "Too many. Wrong direction." He descended the ladder quickly, Elizabeth following close behind. By the time they reached the ground, Running Fox and his companion, an older man called Stone Hand, had already retrieved rifles from their horses. "Crawford's men," Running Fox said tersely. "I recognize Blackwood's grey horse in the lead." Thomas's face hardened. "Get inside, Lizzie. If they're coming in force like this, they're not here to talk." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "I'm not hiding, Pa. This is my home too." There was no time to argue. Thomas hurried to the house, returning moments later with his shotgun and Elizabeth's rifle, a Winchester she had learned to shoot as a girl. Stone Hand had disappeared around the barn, positioning himself to cover the approaching riders from an unexpected angle. "Stay behind me," Thomas instructed his daughter as the riders drew closer. "Let me handle this." The group reined in about 50 yards from the house, close enough for Thomas to confirm Running Fox's identification of Blackwood at the lead. What concerned him more was the presence of several unfamiliar faces among the riders, hard-looking men whose hands rested too near their weapons. "That's far enough," Thomas called out. "State your business, Blackwood," Samuel Blackwood urged, his horse forward a few paces. "We're here on official business, Hayes. Sheriff Miller has issued a warrant to search these premises for stolen property. Judge Chambers suspended Miller's authority pending investigation," Thomas replied evenly. "Any warrants he's issued aren't worth the paper they're written on." Blackwood's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Judge Chambers left for Bismarck this morning. Urgent territorial business. Sheriff Miller has resumed his duties in full. A cold knot formed in Elizabeth's stomach. The judge's departure hadn't been announced, but if true, it removed their most powerful protection against Crawford's influence. Even if that's true, she called out, stepping up beside her father, you need a federal warrant to search this property now. The deed has been registered with the Territorial Land Office under federal supervision. Blackwood's expression soured at the sight of Elizabeth's rifle, held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. The warrant covers all Hayes' property, including the eastern parcel. He produced a document with a flourish. We have information that stolen gold was used in that transaction, making it null and void. Thomas's grip tightened on his shotgun. Judge Chambers verified the gold's legitimacy. This is harassment, nothing more. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Hayes, Blackwood replied, his tone hardening as the men behind him spread out in a loose semicircle. Stand aside and let us search, or we'll be forced to arrest you for obstruction. The standoff stretched into tense silence. Thomas counted at least 10 armed men, too many to fight directly. Running Fox had faded back toward the barn, likely to join Stone Hand in creating a crossfire if shooting started, but they were still hopelessly outnumbered. Elizabeth's mind raced through options, each less promising than the last. If they refused the search, Blackwood would use force, and blood would be shed. If they allowed it, Crawford's men would plant evidence, manufacture a pretext to arrest them or seize their property. The sound of galloping hooves from the east interrupted the impasse. All heads turned to see a lone rider approaching at breakneck speed, Swift River riding as if demons pursued him, his horse's flanks lathered with exertion. Blackwood cursed under his breath. "Stop him!" he ordered, but none of his men seemed eager to intercept the Lakota warrior thundering toward them. Swift River reined in his exhausted mount between Hayes and Blackwood's posse, his expression a storm of controlled fury. "Samuel Blackwood," he acknowledged coldly, "conducting Sheriff Miller's business while he sits in a federal detention cell. Interesting." A ripple of confusion passed through Blackwood's men. Elizabeth felt hope spark in her chest. "What are you saying?" Swift River's eyes never left Blackwood. "Sheriff Miller was arrested this morning by U.S. Marshals for conspiracy and evidence tampering. Judge Chambers didn't leave for Bismarck. He sent for additional federal agents." He reached slowly into his saddlebag, producing an official-looking document. "This is a federal injunction prohibiting any action against the Hayes property or the eastern parcel pending completion of the investigation." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You're lying. Miller authorized. Miller has no authority," Swift River interrupted flatly. "And neither do you. The marshals are on their way here now. I rode ahead to warn Hayes." His hand moved casually to rest on his holstered pistol. "I suggest you depart before they arrive, unless you wish to join Crawford and Miller in federal custody." The uncertainty among Blackwood's men was palpable now. Several exchanged nervous glances, clearly reconsidering their participation. "Crawford won't forget who stood with him and who turned tail," Blackwood warned, trying to maintain control of his increasingly reluctant posse. One of the men spat into the dust. "Crawford ain't paying us enough to face federal charges, Blackwood. I didn't sign on for that." The fragile unity of Blackwood's force crumbled as riders began to drift backward, unwilling to challenge federal authority for Crawford's vendetta. Blackwood's face twisted with impotent rage as his backing evaporated. "This isn't over," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "Crawford has friends beyond this territory, powerful friends. You haven't seen the last of us." With that parting threat, he spurred his mount and galloped away, several loyalists following while others dispersed in different directions. The tension drained from the yard as the dust from the departing riders settled. Thomas lowered his shotgun. With a shaky exhale, That was closer than I care to admit. Swift River dismounted, his movements betraying exhaustion despite his commanding presence moments before. I rode through the night when I heard what Crawford was planning. The judge sent riders to warn us, but I was already on my way back. Elizabeth moved forward without thinking, steadying Swift River as he swayed slightly on his feet. You need water and rest. Your horse, too. As Running Fox and Stone Hand emerged from their positions to take charge of Swift River's mount, Thomas studied the warrior with newfound respect. You risked a great deal to return in time. Those men wouldn't have hesitated to shoot you. Swift River's eyes met Elizabeth's before addressing her father. I made a commitment to this alliance. The Lakota do not abandon their allies. The simple words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Inside the ranch house, Elizabeth poured water for Swift River, while her father brought bread and cold meat from the morning's breakfast. As Swift River ate, he provided a fuller explanation of the developments in Clearwater. Crawford attempted to bribe one of the federal auditors, he explained between bites. The man reported it to Judge Chambers, who used it to secure broader authority for the investigation. When they searched Crawford's private office, they found evidence implicating Sheriff Miller and several territorial officials in a scheme to manipulate water rights across 3 counties. Thomas whistled low. No wonder Crawford was so desperate to get control of our spring. Swift River nodded. Water is power in this territory. With drought conditions worsening, whoever controls water controls everything else. He set down his cup, his expression grave. Crawford has been arrested, but as Blackwood said, he has connections beyond the territory. This respite may be temporary. Then, we use the time we have, Elizabeth said decisively. Strengthen our position, build our alliance. She met Swift River's gaze directly. What did the other Lakota leaders say about your proposal? A rare smile crossed his face. They have agreed. Grey Wolf and 3 other band leaders will arrive tomorrow to discuss terms. His expression sobered. They're cautious, understandably. Too many promises to my people have been broken before. Not this one, Thomas said firmly. We'll draw up formal agreements, have the judge witness them when he returns. As Thomas outlined his thoughts on the alliance, Elizabeth found herself watching Swift River, noting the fatigue etched in his features after his desperate ride. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something else, a quiet certainty, a man who had found his path after walking between worlds for so long. When Thomas stepped outside to check on the Lakota men tending to Swift River's horse, an awkward silence fell between Elizabeth and Swift River. You could have been killed, she said finally, the words emerging more sharply than intended. As could you, standing beside your father against Blackwood's men, he countered. Elizabeth's hands busied themselves unnecessarily with the dishes. That's different. This is my home. Swift River rose from his chair, moving to stand near her, close enough that she could feel his presence but not so near as to crowd her. When I was halfway to the meeting with the other bands, I felt a wrongness in continuing away from here. I turned back before the judge's messenger even found me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I have spent years moving between 2 worlds belonging fully to neither. Yet when I rode away from this place, it felt like leaving something essential behind. Elizabeth stilled her nervous movements, finally turning to face him. And what was that? Swift River's dark eyes held hers. The possibility of a future that reconciles those worlds instead of forcing a choice between them. His voice softened. A future with someone who sees me as neither savage nor curious, but simply as a man. The honesty of his words struck Elizabeth like a physical force. In the social circles of Clearwater, courtship was a dance of hints and propriety, of chaperoned meetings and careful negotiations. This direct acknowledgement of feeling between them broke every convention she had been raised to observe. Yet standing there in her family's kitchen, those conventions suddenly seemed as substantial as morning mist. People would oppose such a future, she said, voicing the practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. From both our worlds. Yes, Swift River agreed simply. The path would not be easy, perhaps impossible. Then why consider it at all? She challenged, needing to hear his thoughts articulated. Swift River was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. My father was told it was impossible to love my mother, to bridge their worlds. Yet he did so, and found happiness worth any price. He gestured toward the window, where outside Thomas was deep in conversation with Running Fox and Stone Hand. Already we built something new here. Lakota and settlers working as allies rather than enemies. Perhaps what seems impossible is merely the first step toward a different future. Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. They moved to the window together, shoulders nearly touching as they peered out. Relief washed through Elizabeth as she recognized the U.S. Marshal Jenkins leading a small group toward the ranch. The federal reinforcements, Swift River observed. Now Blackwood's men will truly scatter. Elizabeth nodded, but her mind remained on their interrupted conversation. As Swift River turned to go meet the marshals, she caught his arm gently. This impossible future, she said quietly. I'd like to hear more about it, when there's time. Something flickered in Swift River's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of a door left open rather than closed. He covered her hand, briefly with his own. When there's time, he agreed. Outside, Marshal Jenkins dismounted, greeting Thomas with a handshake. Glad to see you folks unharmed. We heard Blackwood was gathering men for some foolishness. Nothing we couldn't handle, thanks to Swift River's timely arrival, Thomas replied, glancing toward the house as Elizabeth and Swift River emerged onto the porch. Jenkins nodded respectfully to Swift River. Judge Chambers figured you'd get here ahead of us. Man rides like he has wings on his horse. He turned his attention back to Thomas. Crawford's operation is coming apart at the seams. We've uncovered evidence of fraud stretching back 5 years. Everything from illegal foreclosures to forged deeds. What happens now? Elizabeth asked, joining the conversation. Federal prosecutors are preparing charges, Jenkins explained. Crawford, Miller, and several others will face trial in federal court rather than territorial. Ensure they can't use local connections to escape justice. Thomas's expression was skeptical. Men like Crawford have friends in high places. They rarely face consequences for their actions. Jenkins smiled grimly. Maybe in the past. But Judge Chambers has the territorial governor's ear now, and the governor wants to show Washington he's cleaning up corruption before statehood discussions begin. He handed Thomas an official-looking document. This is a formal federal protection order for your property and for Mr. Blackhawk's eastern parcel. Anyone interfering with either will answer directly to the U.S. Marshals Service. As the conversation turned to practical matters of security and legal proceedings, Elizabeth found her thoughts drifting to the future taking shape around them. The alliance between her family and Swift River's people was only the beginning, a small but significant challenge to the boundaries that had divided the territory for generations. That evening, as sunset painted the prairie in gold and crimson, Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching Swift River and her father discuss plans for diverting creek water to irrigate a portion of their grazing land. The easy cooperation between them would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. Swift River glanced up, catching her watching them. The connection that passed between them in that brief moment carried the weight of possibility, of choices not yet made, but suddenly available. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with obstacles both practical and social, but for the first time, Elizabeth could envision a future not constrained by others' expectations. As twilight deepened into night, stars appeared above the prairie. The same stars that had witnessed countless struggles for this land, from the first Lakota who had hunted beneath them to the settlers who followed with their dreams of ownership. Perhaps now, in this unlikely alliance born of an auction block and a warrior's intervention, those stars might witness something new, not conquest or subjugation, but the first fragile bridge between worlds long divided. Elizabeth stepped off the porch to join her father and Swift River as they finished their discussion. Whatever came next, she would face it standing alongside both of them. No longer a prize to be auctioned, but a woman choosing her own destiny in a territory where such choices had rarely been available to anyone, let alone a rancher's daughter, and a Lakota warrior who had dared to challenge the established order of things. Autumn painted the Dakota Territory in shades of amber and gold as the first chill winds swept across the plains. 3 months had passed since Crawford's arrest, transforming both the landscape and the delicate balance of power in Clearwater County. The Hayes Ranch stood at the center of this transformation, no longer simply a struggling cattle operation, but the nexus of an unprecedented alliance. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke as Elizabeth emerged from the ranch house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the early chill. From the rise where she stood, she could observe the expanded operation that had developed through the summer months. To the north, a small encampment of Lakota tipis stood in a sheltered draw, the families of those who had chosen to align themselves with Swift River's vision. Their presence had sparked outrage in certain quarters of Clearwater, but the federal protection order, hanging prominently in the ranch house window, had thus far kept overt hostility at bay. Near the eastern boundary, Swift River supervised the construction of a more permanent structure, a meeting hall built with techniques from both cultures, where the Alliance Council gathered to discuss matters affecting their joint interests. Thomas had donated the lumber, while the Lakota provided labor and their knowledge of building placements that would withstand the territory's brutal winter winds. Elizabeth made her way toward the construction site, acknowledging greetings from both ranch hands and Lakota workers. The easy cooperation between them still surprised her at times, though tensions occasionally flared when cultural misunderstandings arose. Each incident had been a learning experience, managed with Swift River's diplomatic skills and Thomas's practical approach to problem-solving. The roof should be finished by sundown, Swift River informed her as she approached. Grey Wolf has agreed to perform the blessing ceremony tomorrow. Elizabeth nodded, surveying the nearly completed structure. It's impressive how quickly it's come together. She hesitated, then added, "There's a letter from Judge Chambers. The federal prosecutors have set a trial date for Crawford and Miller, next month in Bismarck." Swift River's expression remained neutral, but she had learned to read the subtle tells in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction quickly contained. "Will you be called to testify?" "Both Pa and I," she confirmed. "They particularly want me to describe the auction." The memory still brought heat to her cheeks, not from shame, but indignation at how Crawford had attempted to reduce her to property. Swift River studied her face. "It will not be easy to relive that night before strangers." "No," she agreed, "but necessary if Crawford is to face justice." They stood in companionable silence, watching the activity around the meeting hall. What had begun as an alliance of necessity had evolved into something more complex, a tentative model for coexistence that challenged the prevailing wisdom about relations between settlers and the Lakota. "There's something else," Elizabeth said finally. "The territorial governor is coming to Clearwater next week. Judge Chambers says he wants to see our arrangement for himself." Swift River's posture stiffened slightly. "The governor has not been sympathetic to my people in the past." "No," Elizabeth acknowledged, but Judge Chambers believes he's genuinely curious. With statehood discussions advancing, our alliance represents a potential template for addressing some of the territory's most persistent conflicts. Before Swift River could respond, a rider approached from the direction of town. Mark Wilson, the young man who had replaced Miller as interim sheriff following Crawford's arrest. Unlike his predecessor, Wilson had shown a remarkable even-handedness in dealing with the Hayes-Lakota alliance, though Elizabeth suspected this owed more to the federal oversight than personal conviction. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Blackhawk," Wilson greeted, them tipping his hat respectfully. "I bring news from Clearwater." "What is it, Sheriff?" Elizabeth asked, noting the man's concerned expression. Wilson dismounted, lowering his voice despite the distance between them and the workers. "Samuel Blackwood returned to town yesterday. He's not alone." Swift River's eyes narrowed. "Crawford's associates from outside the territory?" Wilson nodded grimly. "3 men from Chicago, lawyers by their dress, but they carry themselves like fighters. They've taken rooms at the hotel and have been asking questions about the Hayes property and your eastern parcel." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Swift River. They had anticipated Crawford would attempt to retaliate through proxies, despite his legal troubles. "Have they broken any laws?" Swift River asked. "Not yet," Wilson admitted, "but they've hired 4 or 5 local men, troublemakers without much to lose. My deputy heard them discussing the federal protection order, trying to determine if it had any weaknesses." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Judge Chambers should be informed." "Already done," Wilson assured her. "I sent a telegraph to Bismarck this morning, but with the judge occupied with Crawford's prosecution, he left the implication hanging." Swift River's expression remained composed, but Elizabeth recognized the subtle shift in his bearing, the readiness that came to him in moments of potential danger. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff. We'll take appropriate precautions." After Wilson departed, Swift River gestured toward Running Fox, who had been working nearby. The younger warrior approached, listening intently as Swift River relayed the sheriff's information in quiet Lakota. "I'll double the night watches," Running Fox responded in English, his eyes flicking briefly to Elizabeth. "Stone Hand should take word to the families." As Running Fox strode away to implement these security measures, Elizabeth felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The peace they had cultivated through the summer months had always been fragile, dependent on federal protection that stretched thin across the vast territory. "We should tell Pa," she said, turning toward the main house where Thomas was reviewing the ranch accounts. Swift River fell into step beside her, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Crawford's men will likely wait until the governor's visit. As concluded, they wouldn't risk direct action while territorial officials are present. Unless that's precisely what they want," Elizabeth countered. "Provoke an incident that makes our alliance appear dangerous or unstable." Swift River glanced at her with quiet appreciation for her strategic thinking. "Then we must ensure no provocation succeeds." Thomas received the news with the grim resignation of a man who had expected such developments. "Crawford's too shrewd to launch a direct attack while he's under federal scrutiny," he mused, setting aside his ledger books. "He'll look for legal angles, try to invalidate Swift River's deed or challenge the protection order." "The deed is ironclad," Swift River assured him. "Judge Chambers personally verified its registration with the Territorial Land Office." Elizabeth paced the length of the ranch house parlor, her mind working through potential vulnerabilities. What about the alliance itself? Could Crawford's lawyers claim it violates some territorial statute about associations between settlers and native peoples? Thomas stroked his beard thoughtfully. "There have been attempts to prohibit such arrangements in the past, but they've never survived legal challenges. The right to free commerce is protected, even with Indian tribes." "This goes beyond commerce," Swift River pointed out. "We've created something closer to a joint settlement, Lakota families living on Hayes land, shared resources, mutual defense." A heavy silence fell as they contemplated the precariousness of their position. What they had built challenged fundamental assumptions about the territory's future, assumptions powerful interests had invested heavily in maintaining. "The governor's visit may work in our favor," Thomas said finally. "If he sees the potential benefits of our arrangement, he might extend official territorial recognition." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Then we need to ensure everything is in perfect order when he arrives. Show him this isn't just an anomaly, but a viable model." The next 7 days passed in a flurry of preparation. The meeting hall was completed ahead of schedule, its interior furnished with a blend of settler craftsmanship and Lakota artistry. The small encampment was arranged to showcase the peaceful integration of the two communities, while the ranch operations demonstrated how their complementary skills had improved productivity despite the continuing drought conditions. Elizabeth found herself serving as a bridge between worlds as final arrangements were made, translating cultural expectations, smoothing misunderstandings, encouraging compromise when traditions clashed. Though exhausting, the work filled her with a sense of purpose unlike anything she had known before. Swift River worked alongside her, his quiet strength a constant presence. They had little time for private conversation, but Elizabeth was acutely aware of how their relationship had evolved. Professional respect deepening into friendship, and friendship into something more profound that remained largely unspoken, but understood in shared glances and the brief touch of hands when passing tools or documents. On the evening before the governor's scheduled arrival, Elizabeth found Swift River alone at the meeting hall, adding final touches to the carved wooden sign that would hang above its entrance. The sign bore an inscription in both English and Lakota: "Two paths, one journey." "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the intricate carving. "Your father taught you this craft?" Swift River nodded, setting aside his tools. He believed creating beauty was as important as any practical skill. He studied her face in the fading light. "You're worried about tomorrow?" It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth answered anyway. "Crawford's lawyers were at the land office today. Sheriff Wilson says they requested copies of all documents related to your eastern parcel." "Expected," Swift River replied calmly. "They search for weaknesses that don't exist." Elizabeth sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "It's not just Crawford's men. Some of the ranchers are pressuring the governor to invalidate our alliance. They claim it sets a dangerous precedent. They fear what they don't understand," Swift River observed. "Change always faces resistance." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "You sound like a philosopher, not a warrior. Among my people, the two are not separate paths." His dark eyes held hers. "You should rest. Tomorrow will demand all our diplomatic skills." Elizabeth knew he was right, yet she lingered, reluctant to end this rare moment of quiet between them. "Swift River," she began, then paused, searching for words. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past months—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her, both of them tensing instantly. Swift River moved to the doorway, hand dropping instinctively to his knife before he recognized the rider, Judge Chambers, arriving a day earlier than expected and unaccompanied. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Blackhawk," the judge greeted them as he dismounted, his expression grave. "Forgive the unexpected arrival, but matters have developed that couldn't wait for official channels." Inside the meeting hall, Judge Chambers accepted a cup of coffee from Elizabeth, while Swift River sent word to Thomas. The judge's journey-worn appearance spoke of hard riding and little rest. "Crawford's associates have filed a petition with the Territorial Supreme Court," he explained without preamble. "They're challenging both the federal protection order and Mr. Blackhawk's right to own property as a non-citizen Indian." Elizabeth's hands tightened around her own cup. Can they do that? The eastern parcel is legally registered to James Blackhawk, not Swift River. That's precisely their argument, the judge replied grimly. They claim the dual identity is a legal fiction designed to circumvent territorial statutes. They've presented affidavits from several Clearwater residents stating that Blackhawk lives as a Lakota, not as a citizen. Swift River's expression remained impassive, but Elizabeth saw the tension in his shoulders. My father was a U.S. citizen who formally acknowledged me as his son. My citizenship rights are legally established, and will argue exactly that, the judge assured him. But Crawford's lawyers are skilled at manipulating territorial prejudices. They're requesting an emergency injunction pending full review. Thomas arrived, greeting the judge with a firm handshake before joining the conversation. What about the governor's visit tomorrow? Should we postpone? Judge Chambers shook his head decisively. Quite the opposite. Governor Atkinson needs to see what you've accomplished here before these legal challenges cloud his judgment. His support could prove crucial when the Supreme Court considers the petition. The conversation stretched late into the night as they formulated strategies for both the governor's visit and the looming legal battle. When Judge Chambers finally retired to the guest room Thomas offered, Swift River lingered in the parlor with Elizabeth. You should get some rest, he told her, echoing his earlier advice. Tomorrow may change everything, she finished for him. I know. Elizabeth moved closer, defying the propriety that had governed their interactions, despite growing feelings. Which is why I need to say what I started earlier. Whatever legal challenges come, whatever the governor decides, I don't regret any of it. The auction, your intervention, this alliance. It's shown me possibilities I never imagined existed. Swift River's customary reserve softened as he reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses of a lifetime spent between two harsh worlds. Among my people, we speak of lives that intersect like rivers joining, separate, waters becoming one current that flows stronger than either could alone. The poetry of his words caught Elizabeth's breath. In that moment, the distance between their worlds seemed to vanish, leaving only two people standing at the threshold of something profound and unexpected. Elizabeth, he began, her name in his voice carrying a depth of meaning beyond its syllables. The sound of a door opening broke the moment, Judge Chambers emerging from the guest room with an apologetic expression. Forgive the interruption, but I've just recalled something important about the legal precedent we might employ. The intimacy dissolved, replaced by practical concerns as they returned to defensive strategies. Yet something had shifted between them, a tacit acknowledgement of feelings too significant to remain unspoken, even if their proper expression must wait for less turbulent times. Dawn arrived with clear skies and the distant dust cloud of multiple riders approaching from the direction of Clearwater. Elizabeth stood on the porch beside her father, Judge Chambers, and Swift River as Governor William Atkinson's entourage came into view. The governor himself, 2 aides, Sheriff Wilson, and a military escort of 4 soldiers led by a young lieutenant. Remember, Judge Chambers murmured, first impressions matter greatly with Atkinson. He's a pragmatist at heart, more concerned with stable development than ideological positions. As the gubernatorial party dismounted in the yard, Elizabeth noted the governor's assessing gaze sweeping over the property, taking in the Lakota encampment, the new meeting hall, and the evidence of productive cooperation. Governor Atkinson was a square-built man in his 50s, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time in the territory before assuming office. His handshake was firm as Thomas made introductions, his eyes sharply intelligent beneath bushy brows. Judge Chambers has told me remarkable things about your arrangement here, Mr. Hayes, the governor commented. I confess I was skeptical until I saw it with my own eyes. "We're honored by your interest, Governor," Thomas replied diplomatically. "We believe what we've built here offers potential solutions to long-standing challenges in the territory." The governor's gaze shifted to Swift River, evaluating the Lakota with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Blackhawk, your reputation precedes you. The Indian agent at Pine Ridge speaks highly of your mediation efforts in the past." Swift River inclined his head slightly. "The territory's future depends on finding paths of cooperation rather than conflict, Governor. What you see here is merely one such path." As they began the formal tour of the ranch and alliance operations, Elizabeth observed the governor's reactions carefully. His questions were pointed but fair, focused on practical matters of water rights, dispute resolution, and economic sustainability. By midday, when they gathered in the newly completed meeting hall for the meal Elizabeth and several Lakota women had prepared, she sensed a gradual warming in Atkinson's initially reserved manner. "Your cattle operation has increased production despite the drought conditions," the governor noted to Thomas over coffee. "Impressive." Thomas nodded toward Swift River. "The Lakota knowledge of local water sources and drought-resistant grazing areas has been invaluable. In return, our stable water access through the eastern parcel ensures their families can remain together rather than being forced onto reservations with inadequate resources." Governor Atkinson's expression grew thoughtful. "A mutually beneficial arrangement, then, not charity or government subsidy." "Precisely," Judge Chambers interjected, "which is why the legal challenges being mounted against it are so concerning. They threaten not just this specific alliance, but the principle that such cooperative ventures can exist at all." The governor frowned. "You refer to Crawford's petition to the Territorial Supreme Court?" "You're aware of it?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. "I received a copy by special courier yesterday," Atkinson confirmed, along with several letters from prominent cattlemen's associations expressing concern about what they term dangerous precedents. Swift River met the governor's gaze directly. "And your impression of these concerns, Governor?" Atkinson didn't answer immediately, taking a measured sip of his coffee. "We believe in practical solutions, Mr. Blackhawk. The Indian question, as many call it, has consumed too much blood and treasure with little progress toward resolution." He gestured to the meeting hall around them. "What you've created here is unorthodox, certainly, revolutionary perhaps, but it appears to function, which is more than can be said for many of our current policies." A tentative hope rose in Elizabeth's chest as the governor continued. "I cannot directly interfere with the Territorial Supreme Court's deliberations," Atkinson clarified, "but I can file an amicus brief expressing the territorial government's interest in allowing innovative approaches to settler-Indian relations, particularly when they demonstrate economic benefits." Judge Chambers leaned forward. "Such a brief would carry significant weight, Governor." Atkinson nodded slowly. "I believe the territory's interests are best served by stability and productivity. If this alliance contributes to both, it deserves the opportunity to prove itself viable in the longer term." As the governor's party prepared to depart later that afternoon, Elizabeth stood beside Swift River, watching Thomas and Judge Chambers escort Atkinson to his horse. The day had gone better than they dared hope, yet the road ahead remained uncertain. Legal challenges, community resistance, and the practical difficulties of bridging worlds so long in conflict. "He's impressed," Swift River observed quietly. "But be cautious," Elizabeth nodded. "Politics will ultimately guide his actions more than personal impressions." "Perhaps," Swift River agreed, "but sometimes seeing possibilities with one's own eyes can change what seems politically possible." He turned to face her, his expression solemn yet holding that rare warmth she had come to treasure. "Just as we have changed each other's understanding of what features might exist." As the governor's party rode away toward Clearwater, Elizabeth realized that whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever obstacles society might place in their path, something profound and irreversible had already occurred, not just between herself and Swift River, but in the community they had helped create. The rancher's daughter, who had once stood trembling on an auction block, had found strength in crisis. The Lakota warrior, caught between worlds, had discovered a path that honored both. The setting sun cast their shadows long across the land they had defended together, a land that had witnessed countless conflicts and now harbored the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. Whether their alliance would ultimately survive the forces arrayed against it remained to be seen, but in that moment, watching the future approach with Swift River beside her, Elizabeth found herself facing the uncertainty without fear. Some journeys begin in the unlikeliest of places. Even an auction block where a rancher's daughter was being sold to the highest bidder before a Lakota warrior intervened and changed the course of many lives with a single, defiant bid. Winter descended upon the Dakota Territory with unforgiving swiftness. The first blizzard of the season swept across the plains in late November, blanketing the Hayes Ranch and surrounding lands in deep snow that transformed the landscape into an undulating sea of white. Inside the main house, Elizabeth added another log to the hearth fire as she reviewed the latest letter from Judge Chambers. "The Territorial Supreme Court has set a hearing date," she announced to her father, who sat at the kitchen table repairing a harness. "January 15th in Bismarck." Thomas glanced up from his work. "Dead of winter, convenient timing for those who'd rather we didn't make the journey." Elizabeth nodded grimly. Crawford's lawyers had been employing every delaying tactic available, pushing proceedings into the most challenging travel season when roads might be impassable for weeks at a time. Judge Chambers believes Governor Atkinson's amicus brief has made a significant impression, she continued, scanning further down the page. Several other territorial officials have added their support, citing our success as a potential model for reducing tensions throughout the region. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elizabeth opened it to find running Fox, snow crusting his coat and hat. "Swift River asks you both to come to the meeting hall," he said without preamble. "Grey Wolf has returned with news from Fort Laramie." 20 minutes later, Elizabeth and Thomas entered the meeting hall to find it already filled with members of the Alliance Council. Swift River, Stone Hand, and several other Lakota leaders, along with 3 neighboring ranchers who had cautiously aligned themselves with the Hayes operation after seeing its success through the autumn months. Grey Wolf, eldest of the Lakota representatives, sat near the central fire. Despite his 70 years, he had traveled for 2 weeks through dangerous conditions to reach Fort Laramie and return with information vital to their alliance. His weathered face reflected both exhaustion and urgency. Swift River nodded to Elizabeth and Thomas as they took their places in the circle. "Grey Wolf brings word of new federal policies being drafted in Washington," he explained, his expression grave. The elderly Lakota spoke in his native tongue, with Swift River translating for the benefit of those who didn't understand the language. "The treaty commissioners speak with forked tongues once more," Grey Wolf began. "While the territorial court considers our alliance, federal officials prepare new restrictions on Indian movement and commerce." A murmur ran through the gathered council as Swift River continued translating. The proposed regulations would prohibit Indians from conducting business outside reservation boundaries without Indian agent approval. All trade, all travel, all under government control. "When would these regulations take effect?" Thomas asked, leaning forward with concern etched on his face. "If approved, by spring," Swift River translated Grey Wolf's response. "They claim it is for protection and orderly development, but the true purpose is clear: to isolate and contain my people, making alliances like ours impossible." Elizabeth's mind raced through implications. This changes our legal strategy. The territorial court case becomes secondary if federal regulations would override it regardless. Swift River nodded. Precisely. Crawford's lawyers likely know of these developments. Their delaying tactics make more sense now. They simply need to stall until federal policy accomplishes what their legal challenge might not. One of the neighboring ranches, Jacob Mason, cleared his throat. What options do we have? Federal regulations trump territorial rulings every time. A heavy silence fell over the gathering as the full weight of their predicament settled in. The alliance they had built, the bridge between worlds they had constructed with such care, could be swept away by distant bureaucrats who had never set foot on their land or witnessed what they had accomplished. Swift River finally broke the silence. There is one path, though it carries significant risk. All eyes turned to him as he continued. If our alliance were formalized as a legal corporation under territorial law, before these regulations take effect, we would have standing to challenge their application. A business entity has rights that individuals, particularly Indian individuals, may be denied. A corporation? Thomas looked skeptical. I'm not sure I follow. Elizabeth grasped the concept immediately. A legal entity that exists independently of its members, with the right to own property, conduct business, and defend its interests in court. Her eyes met Swift River's, seeing the same determination reflected there. It's brilliant. The government would face greater challenges restricting an established business than individual Lakota. But would the territorial government approve such an incorporation? Mason asked. Given the controversy surrounding our arrangement? Governor Atkinson might, Elizabeth replied thoughtfully, especially if we structure it properly, emphasize economic development and territorial stability rather than challenging existing Indian policies directly. Stonehand spoke up for the first time, his deep voice resonating through the hall. My people have seen too many paper promises broken. What guarantees that this corporation would protect our rights better than treaties? Swift River nodded, respectfully to the older warrior. No guarantees exist, Stonehand, but unlike treaties imposed by the government, this would be a structure we create ourselves, with terms we define. The discussion continued late into the night, weighing risks against increasingly limited alternatives. By the time pale winter sunlight filtered through the meeting hall windows the following morning, a plan had taken shape, ambitious, unprecedented, and their best hope for preserving what they had built together. 2 days later, Elizabeth sat at the ranch house table with Judge Chambers, who had made the journey from Bismarck despite treacherous conditions after receiving their urgent message. Swift River and Thomas stood nearby as the judge reviewed their draft incorporation documents. This is unlike any corporate charter I've ever seen, Chambers remarked, adjusting his spectacles. Joint ownership between settlers and Lakota families, equal representation on the governing board, provisions for cultural autonomy alongside economic integration. He looked up with a mixture of admiration and concern. Innovative, revolutionary even, but that's precisely what makes it vulnerable to challenge. Can it be done legally? Thomas pressed. That's what matters now. Judge Chambers sighed heavily. Territorial law doesn't explicitly prohibit such an arrangement. There's nothing stating Indians cannot be corporate shareholders or directors. He tapped the document thoughtfully. The difficulty lies not in formation, but in anticipating the legal attacks that will follow. Swift River moved closer to the table. We've anticipated Crawford's likely arguments, questioning my citizenship status, challenging the legitimacy of Lakota participation without Indian agent approval, disputing the water rights allocation. All valid concerns, the judge agreed, but addressable with proper legal structuring. He began making notations in the margins of their draft. If we establish clear citizenship documentation for you, Mr. Blackhawk, and ensure all Lakota participants are legally designated as Indian citizens rather than tribal Indians, we can navigate around the most obvious objections. Elizabeth watched the judge work, hoping to mingle with anxiety. And the timing? Grey Wolf's information suggests these new federal regulations could be implemented within months. Incorporation itself can be completed within weeks, Chambers replied without looking up from his notes. But you'll want the corporation fully operational, conducting actual business, holding board meetings, maintaining proper records, before the regulations take effect. Established facts carry weight in legal proceedings. As twilight approached, the judge finally set down his pen. "I believe this can work," he declared, "though it will face challenges on multiple fronts. I'll take these documents to Bismarck, personally file them with the Territorial Secretary, and request expedited processing." Thomas extended his hand to the judge. "We're grateful for your support, Your Honor." Chambers clasped it firmly. "I've spent 30 years in law, Mr. Hayes, mostly watching the powerful manipulate its machinery to their advantage. It's refreshing to help those using it for more noble purposes." His gaze shifted to include Swift River and Elizabeth. "What you're attempting here represents the best possibility I've seen for peaceful coexistence in this territory. It deserves every chance to succeed." After the judge departed the following morning, Elizabeth found Swift River at the eastern boundary of the ranch, surveying the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward the distant hills where his people had once moved freely across the plains. "Judge Chambers believes it can work," she said, drawing her coat tighter against the biting wind. Swift River nodded without turning. "Perhaps, if enough powerful interests see value in our survival." The uncharacteristic edge of pessimism in his voice concerned her. Elizabeth moved to stand beside him, following his gaze across the pristine snowfield. "You have doubts about the incorporation strategy?" "No doubts," he clarified. "Simply awareness of the forces aligned against us. Crawford is merely one adversary among many who benefit from keeping our world separated and unequal." Elizabeth studied his profile, strong and resolute despite the weariness of recent weeks. The events since that fateful auction night had forged between them a bond that transcended conventional understanding. Not simply affection or respect, but a shared vision of possibility that neither could fully articulate to others. "When I stood on that auction block," she said quietly, "I believed my future had been decided by forces beyond my control. You showed me otherwise." She turned to face him fully. "Now I'm asking you to believe the same, that we can shape what comes next, regardless of those who would prefer we fail." Swift River finally met her gaze, the stoicism softening into something more vulnerable. "The corporation is a means, not an end. If it fails, we find another path. Together," Elizabeth added, the word carrying weight beyond its simple syllables. A rare smile touched his face as he nodded. "Together." As they walked back toward the ranch house, Elizabeth knew their journey remained fraught with obstacles. Legal battles, cultural prejudices, the weight of history pressing against their efforts to forge something new. Yet watching their shadows stretch side by side across the snow, she felt a certainty that had been growing since the night a Lakota warrior had disrupted an auction and set in motion events none could have foreseen. Whatever came next, whether their incorporation strategy succeeded or failed, whether federal regulations threatened or territorial courts supported their alliance, the most important barrier had already fallen. Between two people from worlds long divided, understanding had grown where fear once ruled, and with it the courage to imagine a different future than the one history seemed determined to impose. In that snowy moment, with challenges looming and outcomes uncertain, Elizabeth realized that the auction block had not been an ending, but a beginning. the first step on a path that continued to unfold before them, one they would walk together regardless of how many tried to separate their worlds once more. Spring's first tentative warmth melted the snowdrifts around the Hayes Ranch, revealing the vibrant green promise of new growth beneath. 1 year had passed since the night of Crawford's auction, a year of challenges, victories, unexpected alliances, and profound transformations. The morning sun cast long shadows as Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching riders approach from the direction of Clearwater. She recognized Judge Chambers' distinctive posture, even at a distance, alongside Sheriff Wilson and a third figure she couldn't immediately identify. Her father emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he joined her. "Looks like the judge brings news," Thomas observed, his voice reflecting the cautious optimism they'd cultivated through months of legal battles. Elizabeth nodded, her gaze still fixed on the approaching riders. Good or bad, I wonder? The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of activity since they'd filed their incorporation documents. The Hayes Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company had come into legal existence in early February, the first business entity of its kind in the territory. Its founding had sent shockwaves through Clearwater's established power structure and attracted attention far beyond the county's borders. Crawford, despite his ongoing legal troubles, had marshaled impressive resources to challenge their incorporation. His lawyers had filed injunctions, disputed property transfers, and questioned the legal standing of every Lakota member named in the corporate charter. Meanwhile, word of the proposed federal regulations restricting Indian commerce had proven accurate, with draft policies circulating through territorial government offices since March. Swift River emerged from the meeting hall, where he'd been conferring with several Lakota families about spring planting arrangements. His eyes immediately found Elizabeth's, a silent question in his gaze as he noted the approaching riders. "Judge Chambers," she confirmed, descending the porch steps as the 3 men neared the ranch yard. As the riders came closer, Elizabeth finally recognized the third man, Martin Holloway, Governor Atkinson's personal secretary and legal advisor. His presence suggested news of unusual significance. Judge Chambers dismounted with a vigor that belied his years, his expression revealing nothing as he greeted them. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Hayes, Mr. Blackhawk, I trust we find you well?" "Well enough, Judge," Thomas replied, shaking the offered hand. Though curious about what brings such an official delegation to our doorstep, Holloway stepped forward after tethering his horse. "Governor Atkinson sends his regards and apologies for not delivering this news personally." He withdrew an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "The Territorial Supreme Court rendered its decision yesterday regarding Crawford's challenges to your incorporation." Elizabeth felt Swift River move imperceptibly closer to her side, his presence steady as they awaited the verdict that could determine their future. Holloway cleared his throat formally. "By a vote of 4-1, the court has upheld the legal standing of the Hayes Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company, rejecting all challenges to its incorporation and affirming the citizenship status of James Blackhawk and all other properly documented members." The words took a moment to register fully. Thomas was the first to respond, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile. "They upheld everything, even the Lakota membership provisions?" Judge Chambers nodded, his own professional reserve giving way to evident satisfaction. "Complete validation. The majority opinion specifically cited the economic benefits of your arrangement and Governor Atkinson's supporting brief. Justice Williams wrote, and I quote, "Innovation in frontier development should not be stifled by outdated prejudices when mutual benefit can be demonstrated." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Swift River, whose customary stoicism had softened into quiet pride. "And the federal regulations," she asked, turning back to Holloway, "will they supersede the court's ruling?" That's the second piece of news, Holloway replied. Governor Atkinson has been in communication with the Department of the Interior. Based on the success of your cooperative, they've agreed to exempt established business entities with Indian participation from the most restrictive provisions of the new regulations. Sheriff Wilson, who had remained silent until now, added, Crawford's not taking it well. When news reached Clearwater last night, he apparently broke a table at the hotel and threatened to burn down the courthouse. Judge Chambers chuckled. An empty threat from a diminished man. Crawford's trial begins next month in federal court. Between the banking fraud charges and witness intimidation evidence, he'll likely spend years behind bars. As the full implications of their victory settled in, Thomas invited their visitors inside for coffee and a proper celebration. Elizabeth lingered behind with Swift River, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. It worked, she said softly, almost afraid to believe it. They recognized what we've built here. Swift River gazed across the ranch property, where Lakota families and settler ranch hands worked side by side, the distinction between their separate camps gradually blurring over months of cooperation. Recognition matters, he acknowledged. But what we've built would exist with or without their approval. Elizabeth followed his gaze, seeing their achievements through his eyes. Not merely a legal victory, but a living community, forging a path between worlds long divided. You never fully believed the courts would side with us, did you? A faint smile touched his lips. I believed in our right to try. The outcome was always uncertain. He turned to face her directly, the private moment shielded from others by distance. But some certainties exist beyond what courts decide. The depth of meaning in his words warmed her more than the spring sunshine. Over the past year, their relationship had evolved in the spaces between crisis and celebration. Quiet conversations by lamplight, shared vision for the community they were building, and a growing understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. The ranch yard had filled with people as news of the court decision spread. Lakota families emerging from their homes on the northern section, ranch hands gathering from the fields, even neighbors riding in as word traveled. Elizabeth watched as Stone Hand, still skeptical of written laws, after a lifetime of broken treaties, examined the court document with cautious optimism. "This paper have power?" he asked in halting English, looking to Swift River for confirmation. "This paper recognizes the power we already possess," Swift River corrected gently, "the power to determine our own path forward." As the impromptu celebration grew, Elizabeth found herself standing beside the meeting hall, observing how seamlessly the gathering blended elements from both cultures. Traditional Lakota songs, alongside fiddle music from the settlers, sharing. Food and stories that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Judge Chambers approached, a cup of coffee in hand. "Remarkable what can happen when people are allowed to find their own solutions," he observed. "This could become a template for other communities throughout the territory." "If they're willing to try," Elizabeth replied. "Most would consider what we've done too radical, too challenging to establish ways." "Perhaps," the judge acknowledged. "But ideas spread when their time has come. A year ago, would you have imagined standing here part of this?" He gestured to the diverse gathering. Elizabeth's gaze found Swift River across the yard, deep in conversation with her father and several Lakota elders. "No," she admitted. "But then, a year ago, I was being auctioned to the highest bidder." The judge's expression softened with understanding. "Life pivots on moments we least expect, Miss Hayes. A year from now, who knows what other impossible things might become reality." As twilight deepened into evening, the celebration continued around a central bonfire. Elizabeth stood slightly apart, watching firelight illuminate faces that had become family in ways that defied conventional understanding. Swift River approached silently, his presence familiar and essential beside her. "Grey Wolf wishes to perform a ceremony," he said quietly, "to bind our communities more formally in the Lakota tradition, now that white man's law has recognized our alliance." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the significance, a ceremonial counterpart to the legal incorporation. "More than that," Swift River explained. "Among my people, such ceremonies acknowledge bonds that exist beyond written documents, between individuals as well as communities." The weight of his words carried clear meaning. They had never spoken directly of the deepening connection between them, navigating instead the complex realities of their positions as leaders of this unprecedented alliance. Personal feelings had remained secondary to the greater vision they served. "Is that what you want?" Elizabeth asked, turning to meet his gaze directly. Swift River's dark eyes reflected the distant firelight. "I have walked between worlds my entire life, belonging fully to neither. Here we have created something that honors both paths without requiring anyone to abandon who they truly are." He hesitated, then added with quiet certainty, "What I want is to continue walking this new path with you beside me." The simplicity of his declaration, free from elaborate promises or conventional romance, resonated with perfect truth. Elizabeth felt the final barriers between them dissolving, not erased or overridden, but transformed into bridges rather than walls. "Then we will walk it together," she replied. As they returned to the gathering, where two cultures celebrated a shared victory against formidable odds, Elizabeth reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. From an auction block, where her worth had been reduced to monetary value, to the creation of a community that challenged the very foundations of territorial society, none of it would have happened without the courage to imagine possibilities beyond accepted limitations. The future still held uncertainties. Their legal victory would face new challenges. Cultural differences would require ongoing negotiation. The broader society would continue regarding their alliance with suspicion or hostility. But standing in the firelight, beside the man who had first shown her that established boundaries could be questioned, Elizabeth faced these uncertainties without fear. 1 year earlier, a rancher's daughter had stood trembling on an auction block while a Lakota warrior watched from the shadows. Neither could have envisioned how that moment would transform not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone connected to them. As stars appeared above the celebration bonfire, Elizabeth recognized that the true victory wasn't found in court, decisions, or legal documents, but in the community gathered around the flames, living proof that even the most deeply entrenched divisions could be healed when courage overcame fear and understanding replaced prejudice. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, not as rancher's daughter and Lakota warrior, but as partners in creating a future limited only by their willingness to imagine it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.